Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, at the annual Illinois Association of School Boards Conference, we attend a panel with State Senators Jason Barackman and Jennifer Bertino-Tarrant and State Representative Will Davis as they discuss the budget struggle to fund education, Medicaid, and other programs, as well as if there's a bipartisan agreement over pension funding solutions. Then at about 50 minutes from now, we talk to Paul Timm, president of Rita Security, about his book, School Security: How to Build and Strengthen a School Safety Program. And finally, in about 1 hour and 10 minutes from now, we talk to Mark DePue, the Director of Oral History at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, about the purpose of the museum's oral history program, his recollections of interviewing politicians and veterans and farmers that shaped the history of Illinois, as well as how modern technology will affect our understanding and learning of history in the future. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our Advisory Council members.
The Illinois Channel salutes our Advisory Council members, leaders in business, education, law, medicine, and other fields from across Illinois.
Hi, I'm Delitso Solomoyo, President of the Illinois Association of Community Action Agencies. We are an organization of 36 member agencies located around Illinois which provide needed services to our fellow citizens. It may be helping provide services at a homeless shelter or helping to provide affordable utilities to low-income people across Illinois through such programs as the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, better known as LIHEAP, or working with rural communities and helping them maintain needed community infrastructure. These are just a few of the many services provided by Illinois' community action agencies. But to provide these services efficiently and effectively, we need solid information. That's why, in addition to heading the Illinois Association of Community Action Agencies, I am also proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council. I have watched the Illinois Channel for years. It provides serious coverage of the Illinois legislature, public policy discussions, and one-on-one interviews with leaders from across Illinois. It's the kind of solid, in-depth information all of us need to get beyond partisan politics and political spin and just hear directly what's happening, what's being proposed, and why. I know and you know that Illinois is filled with good people. But if we are to have good, effective public policies, we need to base those on good information. We get that from the Illinois Channel. That's why I watch it, and I hope you will too. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next, from Chicago, at the annual Illinois Association of School Boards Conference, we attend a panel with State Senators Jason Barackman and Jennifer Bertino-Tarrant and State Representative Will Davis as they discuss the budget struggle to fund education, Medicaid, and other programs, as well as if there's a bipartisan agreement over pension funding solutions. This runs about 50 minutes.
On a personal note, some of you may have saw, I was the guy out by the escalator who was chasing the child around. A few of you noticed that there was a child around and asked me, is he yours? He is. We got up here. This is how the day goes and why some of my colleagues are, I think, a few minutes late to join. Sometimes life just is life. My wife and I came up here. We drove up from Bloomington, arrived within the last hour, realized when we got here that our 5-year-old had no shoes on, and there were none in the car. So she raced down the street to go buy shoes while I, performed my real job, which I'm not very good at, evidently, which is dad, hence the 5-year-old running around outside. So, and then I ran into a few of you in the bathroom because I was doing a Superman routine because the rooms aren't ready yet for those who maybe just arrived, so I was, in and out. Anyway, enough with that, and on to the good stuff, which is Illinois state government. Cheer, applause. Yeah, yeah. It is a, there's a number of people in the room for whom I have the privilege of representing in Springfield, and for them, they've probably heard me talk about the state of affairs in Springfield. And truth be told, I often describe it as toxic. And that's a very descriptive word which I think, unfortunately, is appropriate for the environment which we're working in today. Toxic in that, look, we're all professionals, both sides of the aisle. We don't have to love every minute of our job when we're in the state capitol. But I can tell you that in the recent history, the state capitol is just not a friendly place. It doesn't have to be friendly. It doesn't have to be the best place in the world to go every day. But the mood has shifted significantly in the state capitol. And that has a detrimental effect, obviously, on the things which we're all watching in the news play out, all the way down to the little things that maybe don't matter to the 13 million people of this state, but matter to some subset of them, and they look at their state government and say, it's just not working here. And that's something for which that environment, and look, I'm a part of it, right, as a state legislator, so I certainly acknowledge that. I don't think it's something that any of us are proud to be a part of, that environment, even though we're all proud of our roles in serving in state government and trying to do our best to represent you. Oftentimes I'm asked by my constituents, what can we do to help, whether it means help Jason Barrickman or help our state. And I really think that the most significant thing today is for all of the people of this state to urge of their legislators that we continue to seek common ground with one another, and that we continue to demonstrate to one another that even on matters where we may not have a shared idea on what the solution is, that we still respect one another and hopefully can find other issues for which we'll agree upon, and on those that we don't, we'll try to seek common ground. That message needs to be heard by the 177 of us who serve in the state legislature today. And I hope that all of you take away from this conference, if nothing else, that that is an important message for us to hear and for us to live up to. Now, to some of the specifics, last year, a year in which there was, obvious turmoil, there were a few good things that came out of Springfield, and one of the primary things that came out of Springfield that I think was very positive last year was that we were able to fund our educational system at a record-setting level. And through all the problems that we have in our state, we were able to accomplish something that had not been accomplished in 7 or 8 years. We fully funded the general state aid funding formula for the first time in 7 or 8 years. And that took an incredible leap of faith by the governor and legislators on both sides of the aisle, that through all the noise and the chaos and the frustration on all these other issues, that we're able to come together on that one. And I think that's a very positive thing. Now, I certainly recognize that doesn't mean we've solved all these problems within our districts. I certainly recognize that on our mandated categoricals and other things that you're still hoping that the state fulfills its obligations to your districts. But on the funding formula side alone, us hitting that mark, I think, was one of the few positive things that came out of Springfield. And mind you, that came about at a time. You remember what the debate was last spring. The debate was, are we going to change the funding formula, something that we'll all talk about, I think, later today or tomorrow. But the debate last year was, are we going to change the funding formula? And there was a lot of opinions on how we might do that, including John Cullerton, the President of the Senate, who said any changes that we might enact need to direct more money to the Chicago public school system, which for legislators in all parts of the state became a very hot-button issue, which we then had to address through the legislative process. Again, the end result, I think, was a positive step in a very negative climate. Fast forward to today. We just concluded the first week, which is kind of an oxymoron, I suppose. We concluded the first few days of a 2-week period that is called the fall veto session, the time where the legislature comes together to consider whether we will override legislation that previously passed the House and the Senate, went to the governor for signature, and he vetoed it. So we came back this week. We were in Springfield Tuesday and Wednesday. The Senate President canceled session for us on Thursday. Not sure what the House did. And then we go back for a few days after. We're scheduled to go back for a few days after Thanksgiving. Now, we know as a state what's going on, right? Setting aside the full-year school funding budget that we passed, everything else is in a state of turmoil, and that's probably an understatement. We're at the tail end of a 6-month budget, which is called a stopgap budget. That will expire at the end of the year, and with it will come new fire drills and challenges that we will have to rush to deliver a solution to. That's bad management in any system, that decision by crisis, but that's where we're at. Now, as Republicans, we've been very frustrated through this legislative process, and I certainly don't want to, speak ill of my two counterparts who are here today, Representative Davis, Senator Bertino-Tarrant, two individuals who I've worked with for some time on educational issues primarily, and for whom I have great respect. They do a wonderful job of representing their districts. On some issues, we have a different opinion, again, on the answers. But as Republicans, I think our frustration in the legislative process today is that we're not seeing proposed solutions to the many issues that face our state. And I don't need to go through the laundry list of challenges that face our state. But when I hear Speaker Madigan come forward and say all he wants to talk about is the budget and all he wants to talk about is a tax increase, what I see or what I hear from that message is an unwillingness by the Speaker and by President Cullerton and those who continue to follow that line of thinking, an unwillingness to tackle the other very significant issues that face our state, whether it be the need for pension reform, whether it be the need for Medicaid reform, and mind you, with a President Trump, whether you supported him or not, with a President Trump will come very different policies that will impact our states, like Medicaid, where I expect the federal government will say to the states, we're not going to give you as much money and demand of you as many things like in your Medicaid program. And for Illinois, who's ratcheted up the number of people who are on Medicaid and the obligations that we all as taxpayers have to pay towards Medicaid, what that means is that we as a state may be faced with a decision on whether we're going to tax ourselves more to continue to provide services to more people even though the federal government isn't helping out as much, or whether we'll make the difficult choice of saying we can't be the solution to the millions of people who are on that system today, and that maybe we need as a government to do less. These are real challenges. Our pension system, our Medicaid system, workers' compensation reform, an issue which has hit, it really hit all of us around the state, but has hit my own district very hard. I come from Bloomington Normal. I live in Bloomington. In Normal, we saw in the last year the closure of a Mitsubishi manufacturing plant that resided in Normal, Illinois. 1,200 jobs that today are gone because Mitsubishi said, we're pulling the plug on that plant. Now, I don't think that Mitsubishi pulled the plug because of anything related to Illinois government. The reality is people aren't buying the cars that Mitsubishi was producing. But what I do recognize is that that plant still is closed today, and that when we've had people come through, buyers, manufacturers, people who say, look, I need a facility like that one, which is a very good and recently upgraded facility. What they are saying to us who are interested in filling that facility is, I'm not going to locate my business there. I'm not going to buy or lease that plant because I would be making a poor business decision to do business in your state. And it's not because they're contemplating doing business in China or India or elsewhere. They're contemplating doing business in South Carolina, in Atlanta, or in Georgia, in Texas, and in other states throughout our country. And we're losing out on that. And that means to me that we need to do something different in our state. And we cannot simply say, we'll deal with all these issues later, because these issues need to be dealt with today. I think for us to be able to fund adequately our educational system and to do the things that our state should do, we need to have a growing and vibrant economy. And when Speaker Madigan and President Cullerton continue to say they don't want to deal with these other issues that Republicans are asking to deal with, what I wonder is, are they recognizing what's happening in our state, or are they just burying their head in the sand and saying, I hope it gets better, notwithstanding my unwillingness to do anything about it? And so I think you will continue, unfortunately, you're going to continue to see this struggle play out in Springfield until some reasonableness prevails. And on the reasonableness, I hope Speaker Madigan comes to the table and says, I'm willing to negotiate and compromise with you. I hope the Speaker comes to the table and says, I recognize that our economy is not doing and performing as well as it could, and so I'll work with you on your workers' comp reform. I'll work with you on your Medicaid reforms. I'll work with you to see our economic conditions improve so that we can grow our economy. And absent that, I think Republicans are going to continue to hold the Speaker's feet to the fire and try to see our state prevail on some of these issues that I think will help us improve our climate so that the next generation of Illinoisans have a place where they can, once they're through with their education, have a place to work and raise their family as well. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues, and I look forward to any questions when we're through. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we're going to hear from State Senator Jennifer Bertino-Tarrant, a Democrat from the 49th Senate District. Senator Bertino-Tarrant has served in the Senate since 2013 and is on the Senate Education Committee. Prior to her election, Senator Bertino-Tarrant served as the Regional Superintendent of Will County and Secretary of the Will County Regional Board of School Trustees. So please join me in welcoming Senator Bertino-Tarrant.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's noticeably less crowded in here. Since I've started this room used to be packed, and now it's getting less and less. So one of two things: there's so many good programs on, and they didn't know what to choose, or they have great contact with their legislators as they don't need to be here, or they're just tired of no answers. And I'm guessing that's really what is the reality. As my friend here said, I am an educator by trade. I was a teacher, a school principal. I last served as the Will County Regional Superintendent. And so when I won the seat, it was a natural place for me to belong on the Education Committee. And I find it fascinating because from your perspective, again, a lot of these things we listen to, it would come back to us, and we'd have to try to finagle and figure out what we have to do in order to make it work. And on this end, sitting in the chair to help make these decisions, it's interesting to get the perspective from across the state. And that was something I never had, obviously. I born and raised in Will County, been a part of the suburban school system my whole life. So I've had an eye-opener. And I think it became more realistic when we started talking about education funding. And I know we're going to have panels, so I will not dwell on that too much. I know Jason's had a big voice in education funding. But it is something we obviously really need to address. And depending on where you are in the state, you either love the proposals or you hate the proposals. But I think there's been a lot of work in negotiating to have the best of both worlds. And I see Dr. Clark back there talking about the evidence-based model, talking about Senate Bill 231, which is Senator Menard's bill, and being able to come to a conclusion that we can all live with and be happy with. We know we need to make sure our funding is equitable, and I know we need to make sure it's adequate. And part of the problem is defining what really is adequate funding. And again, depending on who you talk to, you're going to have different versions of that. So getting everyone to agree can be a difficult task, but I'm confident that we will be able to come up with something. I don't think that conversation is going away, and it is going to be part of the big picture when we talk about budget. Since I have been there, we have increased dollars that have gone to education, and that's a good thing. Last year, again, we put unprecedented amount into our education system because we know we expect the school districts to do things, and we need to be able to fund those. We have funded it for the full year, and those are all positive things that our schools are seeing. And I was at a senior center earlier this morning speaking to a group who was talking about the community reinvestment program as opposed to the community care program. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, that is for non-Medicaid seniors who are in need of services so they can stay in their home. And again, these are cuts that are being made that we may not realize outside our education world, but people are being hurt by these decisions that are being made. And yes, we are at the top. We are having some philosophical differences. One of the questions that I found was a very profound question. They said, Jennifer, how can we get our leaders to morally understand by not working together, they're hurting us? And it's a great question, and I can't pretend to go into the minds of any of the leaders, whether it's Leader Radonio, Minority Leader Radonio or Durkin, whether it's President Cullerton, whether it's the governor, or whether it's Mike Madigan. I will, and I said this too, I don't think any of them are morally evil. They're not trying to be mean about things. I believe that they just have completely different ideas or ideology of what we need to do as a state. I am a Democrat. I am considered a moderate Democrat in my neck of the woods. People would like to see me be a little more liberal, but I will tell you this: government to me is not a business. It was not designed to make money. It was not designed to have a profit. Government was designed to provide a service. And over the years, prior to years we have been here, when we always call it the good years, when they were taken away, when they were holding off on those pension payments and they were able to delve out things, they opened a lot of programs. They started a lot of programs that now we are seeing are struggling. And so we have to look at prioritizing. But it's hard for me as a person who has who has watched their parents pass away in their home because they were able to do that, but need these services. It's heartbreaking when you sit amongst people who you are telling them that their $17,500 a year is too much money, and the governor says it's too much money, and we're going to take away some of these programs. It's hard to deal with. And so, again, these are philosophical differences. Do we need businesses in here to create revenue? Absolutely. We absolutely do. But again, we have this image that people are running away. These businesses are not coming here. And that's not always true. We need to look at things. We talk about workman's comp. I'm more than happy to look at workman's comp, but we forget the fact that in 2011 we did it. They did some reform, and the dollars are not being, the savings are not being given to the employer. So where do we have to look to that? Obviously, we have to look at insurance companies, and no one wants to say it. No one likes to talk about the big insurance company, but we don't regulate that. We have no. When I ask questions to the Department of Insurance, they don't have to answer them because it's between the insurance companies and the Department of Insurance, and that's hard for me as a legislator who is trying to answer questions to my constituents. The budget is going to be at our forefront. It really is this next year. We need to come up with something for the next 6 months, which is coming quickly to December 31st, and then we have to continue to move forward. Senator Barackman said that the Speaker Madigan has said that he does not want to talk about these non-budgetary items. We need to focus on budget items. And I'm going to have to say I agree with that. Whether or not we get term limits, whether or not we today solve workman's comp, whether or not we look at collective bargaining, prevailing wage immediately, or even redistricting, those aren't going to fix the problem now. I think everyone is willing to talk to things, but again, when you do things in desperation, it's not going to work out best for the middle-class families in this area. You know, last week we were in Springfield, and I'm going to agree with, again, my colleague here, Senator Barackman. It is a divisive. It's divisive under the dome. We have come off of a very expensive campaign season that personally I was involved in. It makes me sick to my stomach how much money was spent on it, and it's flooded back into Springfield. And where I can honestly say I think we like each other there. The people like each other. We're really disliking our politics and people not willing to see a bigger picture. And depending on what side of the aisle you are, with the bigger picture is very different. Education-wise, still, just because we do want to, that's why we are all here. I know with IASB we're going to be, and I talked to Susan, we're going to be talking about licensure. We know we're having a substitute teacher problem. We need to address that. Pensions is always going to be on the top of the ticket. What's going to happen? I know there's many teachers who are scared, not understanding what's going to change. There's always talk about getting rid of PE, getting rid of driver's education, and what's going to happen with the Department of Education. What are we going to look at in regards to federal regulations, if we're going to have a Department of Education, if we're not? And I have talked to many members about revisiting the requirements in para. So those are some things we'll probably see in the Education Committee. Whether or not they go anywhere, it's, you know, you can't ever predict Springfield. That's the one thing I have learned. So I will be happy to answer any questions once we are through here. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Senator. So finally, and last but certainly not least, and we're so grateful that he was able to be here with us today, we have State Representative Will Davis. He's a Democrat from the 30th House District. Representative Davis has served in the House since 2003 and is the chairman of the House Education, Elementary and Secondary Education Appropriations Committee. So please join me in welcoming Representative Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh my, has it been that kind of day already? Oh boy, not going to make our job any easier then, is it? Again, I'm pleased to be here today. I'm Will Davis. I represent the 30th District. For those of you who don't know, is in the South Suburbs. That's where I was born and raised, and now have the pleasure of serving as the representative there, and have been so for a few terms. As I came in, I was a little late trying to navigate the public transportation and what have you, but I am happy to be here. But when I came in, I heard Senator Barackman talking about how how Republicans are frustrated, and he shared some of those thoughts. And so I sat down and I immediately wrote something, and it says, Democrats are frustrated too. So that frustration may manifest itself in a couple of different ways, depending on which side of the aisle you're on. But there is some general synergy amongst how I'm frustrated with the way things have gone, very similar to the way both of my senators have expressed their frustration with the way things are going on. Now, I am a Democrat, and I am probably, I'll probably say this, I'm probably the most liberal member up here. And that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily on the opposite side of everything that the senator is, as he's a Republican, but it just means I have some different views. I mean, if you think about the district that I represent, and if anyone is familiar with the South Suburbs, you recognize that we are a region that when other regions grow, ours does not. When other regions prosper, ours sees kind of the other effect. Now, the senator may argue, well, that's why we need to work on things like workers' comp reform and things of that nature. And I'm not opposed to working on any of those things, but I would just tend to think that as members and that we're, you know, are smart and educated, whatever that is that we can work on all of these things at the same time. So in the same manner that the senator would say that he's heard Madigan say that I don't want to talk about any of those other things other than the budget, what I've heard the governor say is that all of those other things, if I don't get those, I'm going to hold up the budget. And that's kind of the situation that we're in. So it just depends on how you look at the situation. Sometimes when I have the opportunity to talk to groups and we're trying to navigate, you know, your views or different views, what have you, one of the things that I have to go back to is back when Governor Rauner came in the office and he put forward his first introduced budget. One of the things that stands out to me more than anything in that is that in his introduced budget, he wanted to cut higher education by 30%. You all are educators, school board members, what have you. Can anybody operate their districts if they lost 30% of their money right away? No. So again, and I only say that because I just want to put some context to the entire conversation. So we had a governor that walked in and said, here's some things that I want to do. Here's some reforms that I want to make. But oh, by the way, I think we're spending way too much money and I want to immediately cut those things. We admitted that. I think the senator said that in 2011 there was a workers' comp bill or reform passed. 4 years later, 4 or 5 years later, we're just seeing the benefit of what that workers' comp reform was. So if we walked into immediately cutting things, saying that we're going to fix workers' comp, knowing that it's going to be about 3, 4, maybe even 5 years before those reforms come, we're stuck in a very tight situation until we see what happens. And what if what we propose doesn't happen? What kind of predicament have we put ourselves in? So that's why I have a tendency to believe that, yes, if the governor wants to work on substantive issues like workers' comp, pension reform, he and I will differ about term limits for obvious reasons, and I'm not scared to admit that. But, you know, there are some things that I think we can work on. But if he says I want to work on those things, I just have a tendency to think that, yes, we can work on those items, and at the same time we can figure out how to craft a balanced budget that will make sure that we do everything that we'd like to do as a state, including not things like cut higher ed by 30%. Again, if your students that you are educated in the K through 12 system came out and we cut our higher education system by 30%, there'll be fewer institutions for them to go to. There'll be less options in Illinois in terms of higher ed for them to go to. And in one of my past lives, I served as an admissions counselor for Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. So higher education is very important to me, which is why I also sit on that appropriations committee as well. So I can see the entire continuum of educating from the beginning, at least until they get out of college. So those kind of things are extremely important to me. So I only simply say that when we are talking about these issues, that we look at it in a broad context. I'm going to respect what the governor wants, what his Republican members of the House and Senate would like to see happen as well, but there also has to be the same respect for what I would like to see happen as well. And there really shouldn't be a my way or the highway approach to this. We should be able to work together. We should be able to continue to work and meet and work on the issues, whether it's budget, whether it's revenue, And again, many of my Republican colleagues, even if they won't admit it publicly, will say privately that we cannot cut our way out of this situation. We do need to talk about revenue, and it's important that we do so. If you take a step back and even look at the education bills that we're talking about now, whether it's Senate Bill 231, House Bill 3190 is another one that came out of the Senate, and one that I filed in the House is House Bill 828, which is the pure evidence-based model of funding. All of those need additional revenue. So we can't devoid ourselves from the conversation about substantive issues without addressing on the revenue side what we need to do there as well as the need for services. There will be some challenges that will present themselves because of the new federal administration. If they take a more conservative approach, which many of us think they will, there will be less dollars coming out of D.C. to help us do what we need to here in the state of Illinois. And what does that mean? Do we just simply, if the dollars aren't there, do we just simply cut everything? Or should we all engage in a conversation about adding additional revenue so that we don't lose everything that we've worked hard to get to this point in terms of providing or the services that we've been rendering as a state? I agree. Our job is government. And again, when I hear the governor talk about term limits, one of the things that challenges me is that I have a degree in political science and a master's degree in public administration. So does that mean he's telling me that my degrees aren't worth me staying in government in order to use the education that I receive? Well, of course, I would argue to differ. I would beg to differ about that. But essentially, what I'm suggesting is that here is an opportunity for us to do some great work together. We are going to be challenged. We already have challenges, and we anticipate several more challenges moving forward as the new administration in Washington, D.C. takes effect. So we're going to have to figure out where we can work together and where we're going to be able to compromise. And obviously, right now, we're not in a position to be able to do any of that. So again, let's just acknowledge the elephant in the room. We are in a very fractured state right now as a government here in the state of Illinois. But I just believe that we've got great people on both sides of the aisle, and while you do everything you can to represent your own particular interests from your district, there are ways in which I can think about the needs of Senator Berickman in Bloomington, and then I can think about the needs of Senator JBT, I'll just shorten it like everybody else does, in Will County. And I'm in South Cook, so I'm not far from that. So I just like to think that we can come together and think about some of the things that we do. Does that mean we're going to be able to agree on everything? Absolutely not. But we know that there are some real priority items that we must agree on if we are going to move forward here in the state. Veto session, while the first week was very lackluster, the House did cancel on Thursday as well. Much to my surprise, I thought we'd actually stay and maybe consider some dialogue. But even outside of not being in Springfield, the governor has in the past put together some working group conversations. I was a part of the budget working group as an appropriations chair, and my colleagues were, based on their expertise or whatever committees they're on, were in a number of those other budget working groups. Back in July, I think it was, I called a guy named Director Newting, who's the governor's director of the Office of Management and Budget. He was the one that was convening us in the budget conversations all through session and into the summer. And I said, or before we adjourned, and I just simply said, why are we not meeting? We should still be talking about the budget. Just because we walked into an election cycle, regardless of how contentious and bad it was going to be, there's no reason why we should not still be talking. And I asked him to relay that message to the governor, that at least one Democrat said that we need to still be talking about the budgetary items. Unfortunately, because that was, our group was one that the governor called together, the governor chose not to call us back together, at least not up until this point. Presumably, he will do so at the beginning of the year, and we look forward to engaging in those conversations again about the budget. And they were very positive, very fruitful conversations, I would have to say. But we got to a point where now the decisions have to be made upstairs. And none of the leaders, none of the 5 leaders were able to figure out exactly how we wanted to do things. Senator talked about, at the very least, we got some movement on education funding. So we were able to put some dollars forward in terms of education funding. The challenge that I have with that, and while I'm supporting as much money going into K through 12 as we can possibly get, we also put more money in the correction system as well. So what are we trying to tell ourselves by increasing both of those? That yes, we want to educate our children better, but also we need to prepare for more people coming into the correction system. Seems a little odd that we do so. So again, I just simply ask that when you're thinking about these things, regardless of which side of the aisle you support or are on, if you will, try to think about everything in context. That's what I try to do, and I think that helps me to get at least a more balanced approach and at least more balanced thought process relative to some of the things that we are attempting to discuss. So that being said, thank you very much for allowing me to be here with you today, and I too look forward to your questions.
Yeah, Terry Waldron. I'm from Sparta. We're way down south, Randolph County. I actually have two questions. One is about the concept of adequate funding, which was a term that you used, and it's kind of bothersome because to me, adequate funding means an adequate education, which means everybody should be happy with C students. So I don't know I'm not sure, can you explain more what you mean by that? Is this like the bottom line funding?
You said it, yes. And that's what I was saying. Adequate funding, it can be defined very different depending on where you're at in personal beliefs. For some, adequate funding is not good enough unless everyone has a laptop. Every student has a laptop, in their hand, and they're able to take it home and back. For other school districts, adequate funding is a computer lab and somewhere for kids to go. I mean, that was my point exactly. We talk adequate funding is hard to define. Right now, the state says adequate funding means about $6,100 a student. Some people will say that's great. Some other will not. Especially when we're seeing ranges from $31,000 being spent to $6,000, less than $6,000. It's going to be hard to define what adequate funding is, depending on where in the state you're at and who you're talking to.
Okay. Part two is for Mr. Berickman about the pension reform. I mean, we've already gone through the Supreme Court and what was considered that, so what are we still talking about?
Sure. And actually, I'll touch on the first question too real briefly, but on the adequacy piece, for those of us who've really advocated on behalf of the evidence-based model, I think we would say we believe that an adequate funding level is an amount of funds that enables every student in every school district to obtain a high-quality education that allows them to compete in the global economy that we think they need to be prepared for. Now, we can back into that. What does that mean? Graduation rates, class size, technology, et cetera, and back into that, the dollars that it takes to provide that. But I think for the evidence-based model, that's our starting point. And we've worked for quite some time on that, and I think we've made meaningful progress on that. On the pension reform question, I think you're right. The courts have ruled that the pension provision of the Illinois Constitution severely restricts the ability of the legislature to change in a substantive way those pension benefits. But that doesn't mean there aren't things that we can do that I think would survive constitutional muster. For example, we can extend the ramp. I think we can look at blanking on my words, but we look at our rate of returns, and we can smooth those rates over a period of years, so that like this year when the pension boards decided that the assumed rate of return should be lowered by, I think they said, 0.5 percentage point, we can smooth that over a few years so you don't have the immediate detrimental effect like you had this year. Our pension obligations last year to this year are going to rise by as much as $1 billion in our this year cost, and that's $1 billion we obviously don't have. So I think there are still some tools out there. I think it's interesting to note that even, this shows you when I say it's toxic, this shows you how toxic it is. President Cullerton came out with a pension reform proposal a year or two ago, maybe 2 or 3 ago. And today, Governor Rauner has said, I'll support that pension reform proposal, call it for a vote, and Cullerton won't even call his own bill for a vote. So, that's the environment that unfortunately we're working in today. But I do think there is more we can do with pension reform.
Sir.
Yeah, thanks. Paul Slocum from Southern Illinois, Signal Hill School District, on the board there. On the pension issue, is there general bipartisan agreement, irrespective of whether you support the particular solutions, of a list of substantive solutions that will actually work and fix or substantially address the pension problem? Not whether you guys support it or not, but whether it'll work or not. And then, pushing you more, the Republican, tell me what the best Democratic proposal is that will work, and the Democrats tell me what the best Republican proposal is that will work. Thanks.
Do you want to go?
So I guess it all depends on what organization you support, for lack of a better way of putting it. So there's a group, a nonpartisan tax policy think tank based here in Chicago called the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. They put forward some pension reform items that I support. One of the things that we wanted to be able to do was address the ramp issue. To try to figure out how to, over time, decrease our payments and free up more cash that we can put toward education or human services, whatever the case may be. In other words, restructure. Let's restructure the debt, more or less. Now, again, I can tell you that on the Senate side, their colleague on the Democratic side is a young lady named Senator Toy Hutchinson, who chairs Revenue. She has been advocating for restructuring the debt, and have been told by not necessarily the folks sitting here, but other Republicans, we don't want to do that. We're not, no, can't do that. When we were having our budgetary conversations and we were talking about ways to address some of our revenue challenges, I brought up about restructuring the debt and was told we're not going to do that. So again, it all depends on who you want to listen to in terms of the broader conversation. So for me, it's essentially a proposal is I think that's where we can get the most immediate bang. Now what that requires is a little more cash on the front end, and then over time you see the payments go down where we can then begin to free up more cash to do some of the other things that we want to do. So that's something that I'd be willing to support, but some of my Republican colleagues don't like that idea. So they may have an idea that I don't like. I mean, it's hard to get to somewhere when...
But is there consensus on certain things that will work? We don't like them. Some people don't like them, but which ones will work?
Well, again, I think addressing the pension ramp works. I think that works, but you ask some other folks, they may not think it works. I don't think we know all of the different...
Well, what's one
I don't think we know all of them.
The Republicans have come forward that you don't like. Or not you, but the Democrats don't like.
I'm not sure about what the Republican proposals are, so maybe...
I'll come back.
And I was going to say that I don't know if we've heard an alternative in regards to other side of the aisle proposal in regards to the pension. As we know, like we said, we've already stated that the Constitution has been very clear. When I first came into office, we voted on a bill that was negotiated, 2404. It was supported by the We Are One Coalition, which was all the unions who were saying we are willing to make these sacrifices, we are willing to give up this. Because we understand that we have to make some cuts, we need to save our pension system. Well, unfortunately, for many people talking about pension reform, they didn't vote for it because it wasn't enough money. They said it was in the high millions, but it wasn't enough. Well, we have nothing now, and now we have a court ruling that says it's a pretty ironclad wording in there. So who knows if they'll even come back to the table. We're hoping that they do. We talk about President Cullerton's bill. It wasn't exactly 24/4, but he has this belief that will be constitutional, that people in the system can take, they make a choice between whether having a simple COLA or a compound COLA. If you choose a simple COLA, it'll be, you will get your future raises. If you go with the compound COLA, you will freeze once the the bill is passed. It has not been called, no, because again, it's something that they're looking to do at a larger budget proposal. And again, there's always an assumption that everyone is going to vote on this. Because we're all Democrats, we're all going to vote on this, or we're all, they're all Republicans and they're not going to vote on it, or something. It's not always true. It's not. There's different levels, especially Democrats. We talk about liberal and moderate. We have to, listen to our districts. So again, it's not always a for sure thing that if a good idea comes out that everyone in that party is going to support it. But it does. It has to be looked at. I don't know where the gentleman. That's one of the things we do have to address pension reform, because that is a huge part of our budget.
Sure. So I have long believed that if you truly want to reform the pension system, you're going to move our employees to a 401k style, a defined contribution style system. That's a very controversial proposal, but it is a proposal that has been supported by a number of people, including myself. I think if we truly want to enact pension reform, that type of model is what we need to look at. I also recognize that my colleagues, primarily on the other side of the table, but not exclusively, a majority of them do not support that. We have looked at other measures which can provide meaningful reforms. I suggested before the ramp, which Representative Davis suggested, and oh, by the way, I leaned into him earlier and I said, when's the last time you saw Rauner and Madigan hug? Maybe that could help. But maybe. Yeah, I mean, we teach our kids these things. I think we look at the ramp. I think we look at smoothing techniques. I think we look at capping the salaries that are pension eligible. There's a lot of tools out there. And I want to just quickly plug a concept that maybe you've heard about or read about, which is these working groups. Representative Davis suggested some of this. But the working groups sat down without cameras in public, and Republicans and Democrats sat in the room. And we pulled out a piece of paper. We said, okay, what's all of our issues? Pension reform, workers' comp, taxes, revenues, whatever we want to call them. And we had a very frank discussion on all of them. I think what we found is that when you turn off the cameras, there is a sincere desire by a lot of people, both sides, to find that common ground. You had Republicans in the room saying, well, look, if we can put together something like this, here's the types of tax rates that maybe could be sold to other Republican members of our caucus. You had Democrats in the room saying, well, if that's if this issue over here that we care about is on the table, we might be able to find movement over here on inserting primary causation within the workers' compensation statute. Those groups got to a point where they said, we've done all that we can, and our piece of paper is now going to the leaders, governor, the 4 legislative leaders. And I think what we need today is for those leaders to put themselves in a room and say, okay, the rank and file did what they could. They gave us their list. They gave us their suggestions. And it's time now that we cut a deal. I think that could happen any day. Do I think it's going to happen any day? Unfortunately, I don't see it. But it could. And it would happen if Governor Rauner and Speaker Madigan and the others walked in the room with a sincere desire to cut the deal. When they do that, they're going to come out, they're going to say, we got a deal, we're all going to go and take votes. Some votes we'll like, some we won't, and then we're going to move on. And until that, you all are frustrated just like us.
The Illinois Channel salutes our advisory council members, leaders in business, education, law, medicine, and other fields from across Illinois.
Hi, I'm Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Education has never been more challenging in Illinois than it is right now, with comprehensive education reform recently passed by lawmakers and our state's financing of education remaining under pressure. That's why the Illinois Principals Association acts to represent the needs of students and our members. We keep our principals up to date on changes in the law affecting education policy, and we advocate to keep our schools safe and to maintain a healthy environment conducive to learning. With all the changes happening in every field and with the ongoing financial problems facing Illinois, it's vital we all know about changes affecting our lives. That's why the Illinois Principals Association is proud to be a part of the Illinois Channel's Advisory on Education. Their coverage, whether that of key lawmakers discussing changes in education, an interview with the Illinois Budget Director on the state's finances, or the one-on-one interviews with those working in education, all help to keep citizens across the state connected to the real issues that impact the education of our children. I'm Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. I'm also proud to say I serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next, from Chicago, we talked to Paul Timm, president of Rita Security, about his book, School Security: How to Build and Strengthen a School Safety Program. This runs about 20 minutes.
Paul Timm, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you for having me.
You wrote a book called School Security: How to Build and Strengthen a School Safety Program. Before we get into what the book is about, let's let people know a little bit about yourself and what expertise do you bring to this subject.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I'm a security consultant since the late 90s and actually second generation. I grew up at Argonne National Labs where there was a high risk, and what we did is we transferred a whole lot of the strategies that we had put in place to make a campus like that safe into the K through 12 arena, and I've specialized in that ever since the late 90s.
When you wrote this book, obviously, School Security, what is the nature of the threats that you imagined when you wrote the book?
Well, the greatest threat is always the insider threat. Whether it's staff that have issues or students, and there's a very large population of students, or a non-custodial parent issue, a visitor, while the latter group would be outsiders. We have a whole lot going on in a school arena where, for example, the Unity Junior High School in Cicero, Illinois has 3,000 7th and 8th graders in one building. So we're concerned primarily about the insider threat.
And how would one respond to that threat to make sure that security is in place?
Well, there first of all has to be the presence of security, whether it's staff or security personnel. We have to have people monitoring activities that are going on, and we have activities that can become volatile. We've got sporting events. It doesn't take much to realize that we have, emotional investment in sporting events. We've got recess, physical education, cafeteria situations where bullying is always present. But today's environment also has social media threats. So it's not confined to just typical spaces like you and I would have been used to. Now it's cyber, it's everywhere.
And when you say social media threat, what would be an example?
Well, let's say that somebody gets a hold of an inappropriate photo of me, and all of a sudden that gets perpetuated on Facebook or whatever that might be as a social media. Or somebody says, I'm going to get X person on Facebook or even on Snapchat, a place like that. Those kinds of threats can become viral in a very short amount of time.
And are you concerned about that act in and of itself, or are you concerned about the emotional reaction and it being acted out in a violent way?
I'm concerned about both. Remember, anytime we have problems, there's generally been risk factors or we've been moving down the road toward something actually acting out. I want to intervene as soon as possible. In fact, I'd rather prevent if I could. And so all of those things are concerns to me in the entire continuum.
It's amazing when we think about education and how it's changed that no one thought about all this myriad of issues that schools have to deal with, the educators have to deal with. And so this school safety, I will tell the viewers, is a big topic of conversation, in part because there was, I believe, a committee put together under Governor Quinn that then came out in
July, I believe.
Correct.
Are you familiar with that report? Or?
Yes, I mean, I've been reading all of the reports, and I'm familiar with the task force, and actually the commitment now that the state has made to trying to make the learning environment safer.
And given what you know about what those recommendations are, and given your expertise in the area of security, are we heading down the right road as far as making schools safer?
We are, and I just want the arrow pointed in the right direction. There's no such thing as perfect security, but I will tell you this, there are two areas that protect people, which is what I'm most concerned about, that protect people better than any other, and those two areas are communications. We have to be able to get a hold of somebody if we need assistance. We have to be out in a place where we can hear an emergency announcement if one is made. Communications, always important, and then access control. Do we know at any given time who's in our buildings? That's really important. Or conversely, at any given time, who's no longer in our building that's supposed to be. So I always tell people if you only have $1 to spend and an hour to plan, focus on communications and access control first.
Some of the ideas, and first of all, let's talk about the nature of the threat. So we talked it could be a school shooter, as we've sadly seen in any number of instances. Often, as you've mentioned, that can be someone who's a student. As we saw in Sandy Hook Elementary, it was someone who was not a student, an exterior threat. Following Sandy Hook, one of the suggestions that people bandied about is that they ought to have someone trained at the school who is armed. Have you thought about that as a solution, and what are your thoughts?
Well, not only have I thought about it, but I get asked that question probably first in every conference and seminar I speak at. And what I would say is this: if I could put a school resource officer at every school building in America, I would. And that would be the only person I would ever advocate being armed. I am not for arming the general populace of staff. I just think...
But have one person on staff who at least is, or whoever that person is.
I would want it to be a police officer.
Okay.
Yes.
And then I guess that begs the question, if we can afford with education to have a police officer at every school. Right?
And we cannot. And so what you'll see is at high schools, and especially more in your urban areas, sometimes at the middle school level, almost never at the elementary school level, unless maybe they're sharing somebody who comes by once a week or whatever it might be.
Now, as we sit here attending the Illinois Association of School Boards conference, there are vendors, and some of the vendors will have telephone apps, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone knows.
Yes.
And we can have where we punch out, and they do different things. One is that it would go directly to the first responders so they're alerted. Or one might be, as you say, can you hear the announcement of an emergency? It might be something that could be sent out to all the students and staff at one time. Mm-hmm. And in conjunction with those efforts, there are discussions about having doors to classrooms that then lock, that can't be opened. I mean, where you can safeguard the students. There's probably 100 safety and security things we could mention, but just along those lines, what are some of the really interesting ideas that you think are viable and cost-effective?
Yes. Well, let me go with things that I'm really liking the advent of and things that I'm concerned about. First of all, I love mass notifications, so anytime we can take an app and put it on our smartphone and have access to what our emergency procedures are, if nothing else, just for awareness sake, that's really important. If we can then notify beyond that, I've got an incident right now. I mean, yesteryear, what we would do is have to go to the classroom, near the classroom door, and hit a button for an intercom. And I love intercom systems, but if you can have it right on your person at all times, I really like the app. There's no doubt that that's going to be helpful, and we're just beginning to see how important that will be. On the concern side, I really do not like the aftermarket classroom security devices because most of them violate, pardon me, I want to be careful here, I think all of them violate safety and ADA codes. And so if I'm going to buy something that stops the door from latching so that the door can always be locked and I would just have to remove that and then pull the door closed and we'd all be safe. The problem is anyone can come into our room at any time and remove that, and now we can't get into the room. Or If it's a lab, it might be a fire-rated door, which must be self-closing and self-latching. Other products require prior knowledge, which is a violation of an NFPA code. Others cannot be deployed by people with special needs, which is a violation of ADA codes. So I like a classroom security lock that allows us to secure the room from the inside instead of having to go outside into the hall and get it from the outside of the door. I think that's tried and true, and then we require everybody to keep their key right there, maybe on a lanyard, so they know where it is.
So, yes for the locking of the doors, but on the inside.
Exactly right.
What about some of these doors it's been a long time since I was in high school, but we would have some of the wooden doors, but we would also have like a glass window in there of some sort. Should we not have any windows any longer?
Well, we have to have windows. That's a State Board of Education rule because it promotes accountability for what's going on in the room. Anyone can pass by from the hallway and see that. But you're right, that glass, which is generally tempered glass, is the weak spot. We've got a great door, we've got good locking mechanisms, the hardware is all great, but the tempered glass with the use of force can be punched through and someone can reach in and get the handle in a moment. And so we like laminated glass, or if we have tempered glass, putting a film over that reinforces it against forced entry.
Now, another part of the security, we're acting here as if there's a shooter or some kind of a threat along those lines. Another aspect of school security is what happens when a tornado comes. Right. And that might even, for a lot of people, especially in Tornado Alley in Illinois as we are, you know, these days a lot of times kids are being pushed into a hallway and praying. Should we have safe rooms? Should we have what design changes, especially for those schools that are in targeted areas of we know are going to be tornado high points? Yes.
Well, Illinois gets on average 54 tornadoes every year, and there's been more school-related tornado deaths in Illinois than any other state in the union. There's been many changes. The 2015 International Building Codes now require all new school buildings to have FEMA-approved designated tornado shelter areas. But most of our schools aren't being built. They're in existence already. And putting kids in hallways generally is not the right thing to do. And we learned through Joplin, because they had cameras for the first time, that hallways, if exterior doors give way, become wind tunnels. And so restrooms, locker rooms, basements, interior rooms that don't have exterior windows, which are rare, those would be the places. And if we'd have none of those places, and we're just a small building with one hallway down the middle, we can replace those exterior doors, all of the hardware, with wind-resistant door hardware. Probably not number one choice, but we can do that as well.
And when you, I don't know how much of your business is dealing with schools. I mean, here you're talking with school board members and administrators. When you deal with schools, what is the greater threat? Is it weather, or is it more along the line of a shooting kind of a thing?
It's absolutely weather. There's not even close. And the term active shooter is now moving anyway into the term active assailant, which could take into account any number of violence incidents, not just guns. But those are still very, very rare. It's just that it's so heartbreaking to see it happen. Right. We all get concerned, but severe weather by far is the greater concern, not even close.
And these days, with satellite technology, we can see bad weather. We know it's projected. Our schools, this may be an unfair question, but I'll ask you, you can answer it how you wish. Are school administrators, generally speaking, not taking the weather threat seriously enough?
That is a great question. I will tell you this.
I mean, should we be saying, hey, if they've issued a high probability of some tornadic activity, should we cancel schools early as we would with a threatened snowstorm, which we will do, but not with the tornado? On the other hand, how many times can you empty the school out, which is so disruptive? The parents are at work. You know, I mean, you see the problems here.
There's a tension. Well, let me say this. With the technology that we have to track storms, there is no excuse to be ignorant anymore. And there are requirements to make sure we have evacuation maps, you know, shelter-in-place areas. Insurance companies for schools are working on this all the time. And so what I find is the failing is that we put plans in place, but we did it because we were compliance oriented, not because we were proactive. And that, what should have been a living document, began to collect dust, and we're not where we should be today with the information changes, the evolution of procedures that have taken place.
No one wants to have anyone lost, obviously. And sometimes, though, when we run the numbers in any number of instances, while you might be expending an extra, I'll make up numbers, $50,000 or even $100,000 to have a safe room, let's say, relative to the loss of life and that $100,000 spread out over a time period that could be 30 years,
Yep.
you're talking about maybe an expenditure of $3,000 for a school that the budget is going to be measured in the millions or tens of millions of dollars. Do you find it sometimes, like a lot of us, we get cheap, when we shouldn't, that that maybe administrators or board members don't run the numbers and don't see how actually this really isn't all that expensive, especially right at this time when we have 3% or 4% where we can borrow at such cheap prices?
Yeah, the difficulty here is the topic of the day, and I don't envy administrators. They have a whole lot of things to answer for in their responsibilities. They've got curriculums and standards and personnel, all of these different things. And so what happens generally with security, which we call loss prevention, we want to prevent losses to people and places. The first law of loss prevention says this: effective loss prevention, which is what we all want, is always preceded by extensive losses. Meaning our neighbor doesn't get a burglar alarm system until after their house was burglarized, and they go, afterwards they say, wow, if I would have just spent a few dollars, I would have saved all. So the mindset.
They never put the stop sign up until the family of 5 is killed at the intersection, even though they knew it was a threat before.
That's the first law of loss prevention, and we have to do whatever we can to break it. And we can begin with low cost and no cost. Remember, I just want the arrow pointing in the right direction. So
don't make the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Exactly right. Exactly.
So what would you say then to these school board members who are going to watch this interview? They're going to hear what you're saying. What advice would you give them generically?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple keys. One of them is collaboration. What can we do to have a safety planning team that's actually functional and representative, filled with stakeholders, including students? What can we do to have a collaborative effort? Remember, the magic formula is always collaboration plus consensus. Let's talk about what we can do, and then let's come to agreement to do something. Collaboration would be the first key, and the second key is awareness. I think a staff that lives in Mayberry tends to think, well, nothing's ever happened and nothing will happen, and I don't want it to change, and I don't want my convenience threatened. I think awareness doesn't scare us into compliance, but awareness says, wait a minute, we're not living in a day where there's no seatbelts in cars. We're not living in a day where Our Lady of the Angels Catholic school can burn to the ground, 100 people die because we don't have any fire prevention measures. We have changed over the years, and it's time to continue to change so that we can prevent these types of incidences.
As people hear this, and if they want to know more, they can buy the book.
They can, yes.
I haven't had the chance to read the book, but are there more topics in here than what we've discussed?
Well, and thank you for asking that. The book is comprehensive, and I don't want to talk about it a lot, but I want to say we deal with everything from physical security and the cameras and to bullying prevention, because that's an aspect of security, social media.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want your kid going, and we've had, sadly, experiences where kids commit suicide because they were so bullied, and the parents didn't know.
It's all part of the model, all the way to emergency preparedness. All of those things are important, but we finished the book with resources, and I just want to say this, whether you read my book or not, there are any number, especially of online and statewide resources that are available. One of the things, for example, I love to talk about is the Student Security Survey. And you can have a couple students complete a survey that is held right on the State Board of Education website and tells us what parts of the building are least safe and why, where bullying is most likely to occur. The answers that we have all wanted and that we can then bring resources to bear on are there for us if we will take hold of the tools and resources at our disposal.
before we close out, and I could talk much longer, but sometimes we scare ourselves. You know, we see the Sandy Hook shooting and it's horrific, and all of a sudden, or 9/11, and we're seeing terrorists behind every bush. As you look at the incidents nationally, is school safety, not just in Illinois, but nationally, are we getting better? Are the level of incidences going down? Or is it expanding merely because we're expanding the definition of what constitutes a threat?
Yes, I'm going to answer that in a couple ways. First of all, to say that schools are getting safer all the time, and sometimes because of incidents, we've said, whoops, we should probably do something too. So schools are getting safer, there's no doubt about that. Risks are growing. When you and I went to school, there were no social media risks. Yeah. And so risks are, and there will be other risks presenting themselves. And the third thing I would say is this. I would say that, you know, whatever we can do and whatever we can do now to take action is going to pay off in the long run. There's another law that talks about that, but I call it the Giuliani principle because he said that Y2K and their preparations for that paid off at 9/11. They were able to mitigate more efficiently because of preparations they took for Y2K. And what I want to say is whatever preparation schools take today, and some are better than others, it's going to pay off for us in the long run. We have to be prepared. That's just part of good citizenship.
And obviously, if parents, you know, it's a given when you send your kid off to school, you expect them to come home safe and sound.
Yes.
Paul, Timm, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you.
Next, from Springfield, we talked to Mark DePue, the Director of Oral History at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, about the purpose of the museum's oral history program, his recollections of interviewing politicians and veterans and farmers that shaped the history of Illinois, as well as how modern technology will affect our understanding and learning of history in the future. This runs about 40 minutes.
Mark DePue, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you, Terry.
You are the Director of Oral History here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and we wanted to talk with you, but I think a lot of people are unaware that this project is going on, but it's an important project, and you've brought a lot of interesting people and captured the memories and recollections of a lot of interesting people, some of which the audience will know and some that they don't. But give us an overview before we get into some of the details. What is the scope of your project and the purpose?
It's interesting, I think, because you and I have a lot in common in terms of what our professions are. We started this project or program in 2006, and we started with 3 priorities, and those priorities have not changed. Illinois statecraft is the top of the list, and it's a nice way of saying Illinois politics. But we figure we're ideally located in the state capital and representing Abraham Lincoln, curiously, but I have nothing to do with Abraham Lincoln, and we do very little on that. Again, the priority is to talk to Illinois politicians, but not just them, their aides, press secretaries, chiefs of staff, their political opponents, journalists. We've interviewed several as well. So that's number one. The second priority is agriculture, and that's because, you know, let's face it, agriculture has always been central to the story of Illinois and its history. And oftentimes they think that is a neglected area. We haven't spent as much time recently, but we've already got a couple hundred hours on agriculture that we've collected over the years. And the third priority is kind of a labor of love for me since I'm retired military, and that's Veterans Remember. That's what we call it. So we focus on interviewing veterans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and we've got several on the Cold War, the Gulf War, the War on Terror as well.
I don't want to spend, well, on the agriculture, well,
yeah.
I think you did a whole series on that, and of course that's on one hand the state's largest industry, and yet probably the least populated in terms of the people working within that industry. So sometimes it's like below people's radar. What was it that you wanted to bring to the fore that people would know about agriculture?
Yeah, I should say in that particular project, we partnered with the Illinois State Museum. I got on board, I knew I wanted to do something with agriculture. The first year we were there, we found out that Bob Warren, Dr. Bob Warren at the State Museum, was working on a grant proposal, ended up getting a $500,000 grant proposal, and together we filmed 50 plus videos. Actually, that was the projection. We ended up with something like 70, and I'm still doing ag interviews today. He's not anymore doing that. But we looked at every single aspect of agriculture that you could imagine. So it wasn't just the traditional aspects. I kind of focused on my side more on the traditional things and also the capturing some of the history of agriculture. A lot of his were with some of the smaller niche areas of agriculture like beekeeping and pumpkin farming and elk ranching. And we just, basically we covered the gamut. And I've done interviews myself with Charlie Carey, the former president of the Chicago Board of Trade, because I think that's a big part of agriculture in the state. You turn on the radio and you listen to that. We did interviews with Orion Samuelson, who's the voice of WGN on radio. Anybody who recognizes that voice, you know, he's been telling stories for over 50 years.
Within the ag community, he's a national figure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And did one on harness racing, did one with I call them crop dusters, but they call themselves aerial applicators. So a little bit of everything, but to get the diversity of how agriculture is done in Illinois.
And I would say it kind of brings, moving, whether it's military history or the Illinois statecraft, often the public will know, I would argue, the headline information, but they don't know some of the wealth of details about why something happened the way it happened, or some of the many fascinating stories that are involved, let's say within military history. You're talking to World War II veterans. It seems to me as you were talking that a lot of what you're going after is to capture the history of our time. Is that a fair way of saying it?
Absolutely. Oral history democratizes history. It provides the voices of the people who actually were participants in it. So, you know, I've had extensive interviews, as you know, with Governor Thompson, with Governor Edgar, pretty substantial one with Governor Walker as well. But, you know, the folks that you never hear much about is their patronage chief, the term that always rankles people in Illinois, you know, the folks who are involved with the hiring because they have political connections. And that's part of the story, and it's part of understanding their job from their perspective, because there's no shortage of folks who are going to be critical about that side of the process. Or getting the press secretary, you know, the press secretary, Dave Gilbert, for Governor Thompson. Can you imagine the colorful stories that Dave Gilbert has about Thompson on the campaign trail? And, you know, he's an important figure, but it's oftentimes those kinds of folks who get lost in the big picture of things. And that's the ones that we really want to focus on and love to do.
You know, you've reminded me just saying that there's a really troubling aspect to some of recent history. I think the public thinks that since we've had television from the 1950s, that all of this stuff is being saved and is available. And the troubling aspect that so much of what has been recorded, even in modern times, I mean, in the last 10 years or 20 years at local TV stations, is often destroyed. One day I was visiting a TV station here in Central Illinois, and they were literally throwing out their old videotapes. Well, that was years of local history of the stories, the issues. So it's shocking that we don't preserve more of this, and that, as you know, I mean, I credit you with to doing what you're doing, because so many of these stories, as the individuals, the World War II veterans pass away, or as our famous politicians pass away, that it's just a shame that no one is out gathering this. So when you interview someone, let's talk about Governor Thompson, who often in the public's mind they think of maybe still as a young man, because we remember him as a young governor, and now is probably around 80 years old, I would guess.
He just turned 80.
What are some of the stories that you've interviewed him, and what did you glean from him that stands out?
Well, I don't know if this is a condemnation of how I do things or it's to my credit, but he and I finished off with something like 63 hours of interviews, because I figured I'm going to have just one chance to sit down with him and going to drill down as much as I possibly can. And a guy like Thompson has so many memories. He was involved in so much. But a couple of the highlights, the things that he really wanted to focus on in his interviews was the Build Illinois project, and people our age would remember about Build Illinois. He is really proud of the new White Sox Stadium. And that story about, you've heard this story before, I know you have, about the night that the clock stopped at midnight so that they could get the legislation done, and he and Madigan working the floor to make sure they got the votes they needed to build the White Sox Stadium. He was involved with the 9/11 Commission, so we had one session when that's all we talked about, went through that whole process in detail. He was...
and just that alone is significant history.
Absolutely, yeah.
Entirely different from Illinois, but significant to capture.
Mm-hmm. He was a good friend of George Ryan, so that was kind of an emotional session where we talked about the George Ryan trial, his time as a prisoner, him being released, and getting those sides of the story as well. Not the kind of stuff that you're going to see in official papers. And as you mentioned, one of the things that we wanted to do in this, Dr. Tom Schwartz was the state historian when I was hired. It was his intention. He knew that the kind of papers we were getting from politicians just didn't have the meat on the bones that we wanted to have, and that saw oral history as the way to put some meat on the bones.
And it goes, you bring up a point. So much of history, as we have the books behind us, is printed history.
Yeah.
In this era, it should be multimedia history. At least we can have the emotion of the person speaking about it. Now, because none of us are funded properly in the state, a lot of what you do when you talk about 60 hours, people might think that's all televised. It's mostly just the audio recordings, is that correct? But you also do some video.
Yeah, and for both Thompson and Edgar, which are big projects, and not just focusing on those two individuals, but their opponents and their staffers and people who worked in administration and a variety of things. The vast majority of that is audio interviews. But in both Thompson and Edgar's case, we focused in on one particular election campaign that was especially important to them and to Illinois history, and videotaped it. So in Edgar's case, it was the 1990 election, where he ran against Hartigan, and very close election. And in Thompson's case, it was a no-brainer. It was the 1982 election. That was actually his third election. But the 1982 election, and the first time he ran against Adlai Stevenson, and at the end of the day in November, on election day, it was 5,074 votes that separated the two. So the results weren't known until about a week before the inauguration, when the Supreme Court decided the state wasn't going to go through a total recount, and that vote that the election board had validated on election night would stand, and declared Thompson the governor.
Interesting, because it's kind of a precursor to what we saw in 2000 with the presidential election,
yeah,
where the Supreme Court ordered a stop to the counting.
Yeah, very much so. And Stevenson had a lot to say. I've interviewed Adlai Stevenson about the 82 and the 86 election. Boy, there's an interesting contrast in the two men and their style, and the importance both of them saw in that election. But Stevenson still insists that he won that election, and he talked about hanging chads in the 1982 election, if you can imagine, because they were just trying out that new punch card.
For people who would hear this and are interested, are these interviews that you've conducted, are they available online?
That is our goal from day one, to get all of this available to the public as much as possible. That is well, you understand how this works. That's a big part of the work that we have to do. It's not just doing the interview and then it's over. Most of the work happens after the interview is completed. But it's all available on our website. That site is www.oralhistory.illinois.gov. And then as you go to that main page, on the right-hand side, you'll see all of the different projects listed, Illinois Statecraft. So if you go to Illinois Statecraft, you'd find, now you have a selection of, I believe, 8 different projects within that. So you've got Governor Thompson's series, you've got Governor Edgar's series, Governor Walker, he has a smaller series, but we've got one on the Equal Rights Amendment fight. We've got a series with legislators. We've got a collection with different journalists. And one of the donated collections we have that's on that particular page is a series of interviews that was done about 4 years ago during the 100th anniversary of Reagan's death, or Reagan's birth, I'm sorry. So Reagan in Illinois is the name of that project.
One of the most, of course, in our time and recent time, about 8 years ago or so, was the impeachment of Rod Blagojevich, which in the history of Illinois will certainly stand out. Have you done anything on that?
I've interviewed quite a few people where, you know, there's a short story or a little bit of discussion about Blagojevich, and we have a cooperation with Bernie Zaracki, who wrote the book Just Cause, the book about the impeachment trial in the legislature. And there's nothing up on our website yet, but our hope is that Bernie will go back and re-interview the people that he did in terms of doing the research for that book as oral history interviews, and that they will be up available on the website. That's a long-term project.
As people hear this, let's, you know, for those of us, maybe it sounds like a silly question, for those of us who like history, but why does it matter? What's the point of all this?
Because it's not just the things you read in the newspaper. It's, as you started off by saying at the very beginning, it's the why the politicians made the decisions they did, the passion that was involved with particular issues that they were pursuing, to get a much greater in-depth understanding of why things happen, when they happen. And it's, you know, our job as the oral historian to provide that historical context. But you know, when I first started, this is kind of an aside from politics, but when I first started, I was thinking, you know, everybody does interviews with veterans. So I love to do them. The public is very interested in them, but are we going to add historical knowledge and facts? And I can tell you that some of the stories I've collected have definitely deepened my understanding of military history, of veterans history, and I think the public as well. So we're, even for World War II and Korea especially, and for Vietnam now, we're adding to the corpus of knowledge about those wars, because it's from the individual's perspective and what they are involved in.
And I will share, I mean, I've had the opportunity, which you treasure, to interview various people. One day I interviewed 3 recipients of the Medal of Honor, and to hear one of them was Sammy Davis, who was from Illinois, from Vietnam. It's one thing to hear that someone won the Medal of Honor, but to have someone tell their story in depth about how they were knocked unconscious and had to level their artillery gun to the enemy who was coming in so fast, and to hear that, you know, where these people are fighting for their lives, it gives you, you know, I would say history is never really just an intellectual exercise. You have to understand the emotions of the moment, whether it's someone fighting for their life on a battlefield, or a governor or a president making a decision. And it seems to me ironic that sometimes the stories like The West Wing on TV or House of Cards, while they're fictionalized, if people understand how a policy is developed, but through all the machinations of politics and wheeling and dealing, it's not too terribly different than sometimes what goes on behind the scenes in Illinois politics.
Yeah, how the sausage is made, right? Yeah, yeah, we definitely get an aspect of that as well.
When you, how do you prepare for an interview? When you say you do 60 hours, and I think with Governor Edgar, I think you said you did something like 40 hours.
57, I think, 57. With Edgar.
So extensive time. How do you prepare for those interviews? That's obviously, I'm normally doing a half an hour or an hour at a time. Entirely different process to do 60 hours.
We started with both of those to develop a pretty detailed, as much detail as possibly could, a timeline of their lives and all of the personal events, but especially all the political events in their lives. And then it's this, that for a typical interview, let's say it's somebody not at the scale of an Edgar Thompson, we sit down with them and do a pre-interview. And I write down all of the different highlights of their events, and I'm basically in those taking a chronological approach so that I'm hitting all of the highlights. And inevitably, when you do the pre-interviews, you start to to pull out some of the stories, the colorful aspects, the things that you're really going after. So you sprinkle in your notes that, hey, ask her about the ERA fight in 1982 or something like that. And then I go back and I develop a much more thorough outline and do all the necessary background research that's involved. I always feel like I'm not doing enough, but I realize I don't have to be the expert. I have to know enough to ask the right questions to elicit the revealing responses we're looking for.
You know, I'm reminded again of that interview, which we have online, that I did with the Medal of Honor winner, Sammy Davis. And I'm asking because you may have the same experience, or do you have the same experience? But in his case, he started giving almost like a rote recollection of what happened. But after about 2 or 3 minutes of telling the story, it's like he went into a zone where the emotions of that moment came back. And it was just fascinating. Once he got emotionally himself back into telling the story. Do you have that where when you scratch the surface of something and hear this emotional recollection comes back to the fore, and maybe you were unaware of it, or it's just surprising when you hit that?
Well, it's certainly the goal to get them to open up and to reveal more and to get them to reflect, and it happens all the time as well. You made me think about things I haven't thought about in 60 years or 70 years.
Which is the point, right?
Yeah, the point. Yeah, the emotions that's a tricky business when you unlock those emotions. And I've had a couple of very interesting occasions where they get to a point and suddenly it seems like mentally they blocked out something themselves. I'm trying to drag out stuff that they have been trying to forget for decades. And sometimes they just say they don't want to do it in the first place. That's not uncommon for some of this. But there are those moments, just as you were talking about.
I one time said, just as in passing, on 9/11, those of us who were alive and lived through 9/11, that we often heard how veterans didn't want to talk about the war. When we collectively went through such a horrible exercise or event as 9/11, that who wants to go back and revisit that, because it's such an ugly emotion, that maybe then we can have a little inkling into why those who have suffered through some horrible wartime experience really are not looking forward to bringing that back to the fore when they've tried so much to put it behind them.
Yeah, you mentioned the Medal of Honor winners. I've gotten the sense doing this that there was this moment in time, and it was in the 1990s, a decade before I even started, but it was about then that the World War II veterans were finally at the point in their lives where they were willing to share some of these stories. And so we're kind of at that same point now with the Vietnam folks, that these are very painful stories for them to share. And it's just difficult when you're that close to it in terms of the amount of time that's elapsed. And it takes some time for them to process themselves. We're talking decades now that they finally got to the point where they're willing to share some of the stories and to reflect on things. And quite frankly, a lot of the times they don't remember the details at all anyway. They're not there anymore. There's no way they could possibly bring them up.
For those who haven't been here, the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum, they're actually two different buildings and kind of have two different missions. We're sitting in the library in your office, which is more about research. And if someone wants to come and do research on some aspect of Illinois history, they can do that here. The museum, I would recommend, if people are bringing their families, they go to the museum, and it tells in a very interesting way the story of Abraham Lincoln and his life and presidency. But also at the museum, there's a stage, the Union Theater, and you are involved on occasion. The museum, puts on these events that are also fascinating. Lectures from people. Recently, General John Borling from Vietnam, who was a prisoner of war for 6.5 years, gave a fascinating talk. But also I remember early on when the museum opened up, they had a series called A Night to Remember. Dan Rostenkowski was there. on different people on subsequent nights. Some of these are also recorded by the museum audiovisual department. Do you ever have occasion to go back and look at those resources when you're doing your research and preparation for some of your interviews?
Probably not as much as I should. Obviously, for the General Borling presentation, I had the chance to interview him. That one was 31 hours because it wasn't just about his 6.5 years in prison camp. That's absolutely what he didn't want to do, is just focus on that. So we talked about his entire career. But the one project that I really enjoyed doing, in 2015, we had a series of presentations called The Evening with the Creators. And in that case, I did have to go back and do some research. And these were people with the creation of this institution. So to get ready for a series of panel discussions, I essentially had to go out and do quite a few interviews myself with some of the main people who were responsible with the creation of the museum in the first place. The creative genius of Bob Rogers and BRC Imagination Arts that created the exhibits, talking to Tom Schwartz about the background information, meeting with Julie Cellini and Susan Mogerman about the creation of the museum and the library from the standpoint of working in the agency, being the chairman of the board of trustees, and there's quite a bit of politics in all of that as well, as you might imagine.
We should a little bit about your background. You're not just a academic historian. What give us a little bit of your background, and you also include some military history.
Well, just the thumbnail sketch. I graduated from the military academy at West Point in 1976. Had a little over 5 years in active duty. Stepped out of that. That would have been in 1981. Went to graduate school at the University of Iowa, the real U of I is the way I look at things, and got my master's. Decided to take a full-time job at Western Illinois teaching ROTC. So I was back full-time with the military, but really representing the Guard at that time. Retired from the National Guard in 2001, had a chance to command a Air Defense Battalion up in Chicago for 3 years, and then came back to Springfield again. Spent most of my time in Springfield. Retired in 2001, and then went back and finished up my dissertation and wrote a couple books. And thankfully, I wrote a book about the 233rd Military Police Company that had just come back from their one-year deployment in Iraq in 2004. At the same time, I was finishing up my dissertation, and it occurred to me, wow, this is the next chapter of my dissertation, because the dissertation was on the evolution of the citizen soldier in American history. So I spent a year interviewing them about their experiences in Iraq. Now, there's the opposite of World War II. These guys had memories that were only a year old, and those emotions were much rawer, as you might imagine. Right. But having that book and having that experience really helped me not just land this job, but to be successful in the job as well.
To what extent, when you interview a veteran who's seen combat in current time, in let's say Afghanistan or Iraq, how does their experience compare? Is there a difference between the life of the citizen soldier between today and 70-something years ago in World War II, or is it pretty much uniform?
Well, I've always maintained that once the soldier gets to combat, the differences quickly go away. But my fascination has always been that friction that's existing between the regular military and the citizen soldier side of the equation, because the regular folks are oftentimes likely to kind of look down their nose and say, yeah, these are a bunch of amateurs. There's always that amateur element in American history that's kind of threaded through there. The same discussion about politicians. Do we want to have the professional class of politicians or citizen politicians? Same kind of dynamic going on. But once they get to combat, that kind of all goes away. And what struck me about the 233rd, these are civilians. They're police officers and corrections officers and waitresses and students and a wide variety of different kind of experiences. And suddenly they're expected to go to Baghdad, and they're the very first MP company to get to Baghdad. And so the company commander for the MP unit drives around with some Iraqi he'd never met before who's saying, over there, that used to be a police station. And no, that's a police station over there. And they were quickly joined by other MP companies. But I looked at this. These guys were the ideal. They didn't have this cavalry or infantry mentality where you need to meet and destroy the enemy. They had a police officer mentality, and that's exactly what they needed to have on the ground at the time.
There's been so much history of late. Not far from where we are sitting is the old state capitol, which has history throughout the years. But it was there in 2007, I guess, that Barack Obama announced his presidency, and there in the summer of 2008 that he also announced his running mate was Joe Biden. So we even have current history. How much history do you, I mean, we talk about oral history, so you're not necessarily going back to the Civil War period, or how far back do you go, and what have you been able to capture that maybe now may be gone as far as the recollections of people?
Well, the definition of oral history is interviewing people about their own personal memories. So we can't, and we certainly sometimes sit down with somebody about their World War II experiences, and if the opportunity presents itself, then I'm going to hear about their family's history back in the Civil War, but that's all secondhand, so it's not the same level of quality. That primary source document is talking about individuals, about their personal experiences. And we have to make some trade-offs as well, and the politicians, talking to the politicians is especially important. The first time we had an advisory board meeting about what to do with Illinois politics, Governor Edgar was sitting in the room, and the very first thing he said, I believe, was, well, what you don't want to do is talk to a politician while they're still in the arena. You need to wait until they've made the decision and actually retired, because otherwise you're not going to get a candid conversation. Even then, it's hard to sometimes get a candid conversation with these guys, as you know. And then the subject came up, well, gosh, we've got the President of the United States used to be in the legislature. Shouldn't we be interviewing people in the Illinois Senate about that? And again, Edgar said, no, because, you know, they're either a Republican and they're going to demean what he was doing in the legislature, in the Senate, or they're going to be Democrats and going to be very complimentary. You're not going to get that candid conversation. So I've gotten a few of those with recently retired Illinois state senators, and we certainly hope to do more of that in the future. But I think that kind of gives you the dynamic that we're looking for there.
And on the other hand, I would say, aside from the oral history, you are quite an expert in various fields, and recently you gave, as we are taping this in 2016, we are going through a 4-year period where it's the 100th anniversary of the First World War. You recently gave a address at the Lincoln Museum on trench warfare in World War I, which was fascinating, and I think ran about an hour and a half, which, you know, to get the information that you gave in an hour and a half, people would probably have to read 10 books, which I suspect they're not going to do, but it's worth sitting. And plus, I don't know to what extent you look at this. To me, that seems to be such a resource for, we don't know what technology is coming in the future.
Yeah.
But we've wired the schools, and so if there are classrooms studying about the First World War, they can listen to either all or a portion of your lecture, and some of these people that you are now capturing, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people will be able to hear that. Isn't it fascinating, because even our movies, we're not even at 100 years to where there was sound in movies. That was 1927.
Yeah.
How do you ever think about how modern technology, to where we have their facial expressions, to where we have their voice telling these stories, how that is going to alter the understanding and of history as compared to the whole previous period of history beforehand, which was all text?
Terry, that sounds like a great conversation over dinner sometime between the two of us. I probably haven't thought about it as much as I should, but I certainly have an understanding that if I look at our grandparents, the things they saw in their lives from maybe when they were born in the 1870s or 1880s up through the 1950s, imagine how different the world was for them. Now, we think the world is incredibly different for us, and it certainly is because of the digital age and technology and the internet and things like that. But we're talking about from riding a horse or walking everywhere you went to having railroads and telephones and televisions and the whole gamut of airplanes. And suddenly you can communicate across the country in just seconds, and that was never the case before. That just, I don't think people have an understanding and appreciation for that. And you mentioned the presentations. I started doing presentations on the Korean War because that was one of my fascinations that I mentioned to you earlier. And people just don't know the first thing about it. So I did a series of presentations, Korean War. And then when we got to the Civil War sesquicentennial, you know, we didn't seem to be doing too much, so I volunteered. Maybe this was my mistake. I volunteered to do a series of presentations on the major battles of the Civil War. And I think we ended up with 13, focusing on 13 battles over that time period. And then threw in the movies of the Civil War, because I'm kind of a movie junkie as well. And those seem to be very popular. And my approach in all of that, and the World War I stuff as well, is when I struggle to understand something, I just keep figuring it out until I do understand it, and then try to present it in the way that the public can understand it as well. And trench warfare is a perfect example. Who in their right mind would get out of that trench and run across no man's land to almost certain death or injury? You know, it boggles my mind.
Well, and it goes to show how we often say about how generals are fighting the last war, and World War I, with all that modern technology, the strategies that weren't much different than the Civil War, where you
exactly.
were fighting, you know, with guns that weren't much more than muskets. And I guess that's one of the things to where we can learn from the values, again, of history, is we can learn and apply these lessons and even ask ourselves, given the new technology, are we fighting the last war? What do we need to change given the technology we have today? I sometimes often think that applies not only to warfare, but I wonder how is social media changing our democracy? Are we running campaigns as if it's still the old days where it's just television? And you look at what Donald Trump is doing. Interestingly, he's almost more attuned to the social media aspect than some of these professional campaign advisors.
And that was the thing that really propelled Obama to success, is that he tapped into all that social media and got that energy going for his campaign. So you're absolutely right. That's a great parallel, that how our politics are changing, because not just the social media, but look at how it's changed, because the Fairness Act was revised back in the late 80s, and suddenly you have Rush Limbaugh and then this plethora of other conservative voices on the radio, and then you've got Fox News and conservative cable TV, and so you have all these different places that people now get their information, and that has certainly revolutionized the way American politics has been done for the last 30 years.
Let me, before time is growing short, but on this project, neither you or I are getting any younger, but it seems to me it's such a critical thing to continue to do through the decades. Let me give you a platform to make a bit of a pitch about, you know, there's so much that the state spends money on, and I often think for pennies on the dollar we can capture things as you're working on, because first of all, you have some volunteers that work with you, but basically you're an enterprise of one professional. Are you funded by the library, by the museum, by the state? How do you get your funds? And if you had more, what else could be done?
Well, as you know, the Library Museum, Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum, is run by the state of Illinois. So now we don't have a budget, and we're working on very thin budgets. We have some profit potential over in the museum, but that funds only a limited amount of things. I really haven't had to restrict my travel at all. My hope would that someday I'll have a full-time assistant. And in part, I say that because you and I know how Illinois works. Illinois hiring procedures work. If I retire and there's no full-time assistant, then all those 30-some volunteers I have working for me will no longer have any kind of support structure to keep doing the transcripts, to go out and do more interviews and add to the collection. That will come to a screeching halt, and then a couple years down the road, somebody says, well, gosh, we can't afford to hire that again. And just like what had happened when Cullum Davis had started the oral history office at Sangamon State University, and then left after this incredibly successful program that he'd built up over the 2 decades, and then left in about 1988 to head up the Lincoln Eagles paper project, and that whole program just kind of atrophied until I see myself kind of picking up the baton from Cullum Davis and what he had done, especially in Illinois statecraft, and carrying that ball forward. But you know, the story of Illinois politics isn't going to end. That's something that we need to continue to build on in the next generation and beyond.
And as you say, hopefully you can get all of this rich material that you have available online, which is, you know, we talked about the technology. Now people don't physically have to come to a library to access a lot of this. And lastly, though, too, what about just having some, are there going to be transcripts so that for people who are deaf and all, can they, you know, are they going to be at, would you print them out, or are they going to be on the video when you have video, or how would those be available?
Well, that level of technology is beyond me right now, but our goal from day one, Terry, has been that there's not only all of the audio and or video available on the website, but that there's a transcript as well. So we've got about 800 interviews that we've collected. There's roughly 660 that are already on the web. There's a lot more to come, obviously. And a sizable percentage of those already have transcripts completed. The goal from day one was to have transcripts for everything. Not so much the same dynamic for donated collections, but the ones that we've done ourselves, to have transcripts completed. But that's a very long process. I'm kind of proud, actually. You might be surprised at this, Terry, but I'm kind of proud that my transcribers now, when I'm assigning out projects for them to do, I'm giving them interviews that were done in 2013, in September of 2013. So, gosh,
proud that you're that caught up.
That we're only 3 years behind, but consider that these are volunteers, very talented people who help out on transcribing and editing, and amazingly dedicated. And I think they love it, and they come back to it so much because they get caught up on the stories. They like to hear these stories firsthand that these people have to share.
Well, and I should say, too, it's not just for the hearing impaired that we have a transcript. If there's a transcript, someone can do a word search, and you might be able to find the specific point of an interview that you want to hone in on rather than just delving into 60 hours.
You know, if you're a journalist, if you're a researcher, if you're a scholar, if you're working on a dissertation or you're writing a book, you're not going to try to wade through a 4-hour audio interview. You want to go right to the issues that you want to focus on, and that's what the transcripts allows you to do. So we have searchable PDF transcripts when we get them done.
Mark DePue, we could talk for hours more. It's always fun, and you and I both love this as a subject matter, but time grows short. Well, thank you for joining us. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Well, I'm all for that. Thank you, Terry.
Thanks.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. The Illinois Channel salutes our advisory council members, leaders in business, education, law, medicine, and other fields from across Illinois.
Hi, I'm Don Schaefer, Executive Vice President of Midwest Truckers Association. We represent over 2,700 member companies in 15 states who operate in Illinois. These men and women are responsible for keeping the food in your store, the fuel at your gas station, and bringing the books to your schools. In fact, look around the house and virtually everything you see will have been moved at one time or another by a truck. That's why our issues are your issues. Whether it's the taxes they pay, the price of fuel, or the regulations truckers must endure, in the end, you, the consumer, pay the price. That's one reason why I'm proud to serve on the Illinois Channel Advisory Council. Just as truckers deliver the goods on our nation's highways, the Illinois Channel delivers the information you need on your information highway. The Illinois Channel reaches 1.4 million cable homes across the state, as well as making their programming available as a video stream on their website at illinoischannel.org. Delivering the goods is Midwest Truckers' business. Delivering the information you need to stay connected to the actions of state government, that's the Illinois Channel's business. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.